The movie opens in 1969, showing FBI agent Carl Hanratty Jr. arriving at a French correctional facility to retrieve the illness-afflicted Frank Abagnale Jr., who makes an attempt to flee from the prison before being transported to the United States to face charges for various criminal offenses. Frank Abagnale Jr. enjoyed a comfortable, well-off existence in New Rochelle, New Jersey, living with his father Frank Sr. and his mother Paula, who was French. During one memorable evening, Frank Sr. received recognition from the local Rotary Club, which filled his son with deep respect and admiration as he watched from the audience. Later that same evening at their home, Frank Sr. shared the story of how he first met Paula while Frank Jr. and his mother were dancing together. When Paula accidentally knocked over her wine glass, staining the carpet, Frank Jr. rushed to the kitchen for a towel. Upon his return, he witnessed a tender moment between his parents as they danced together to an Ella Fitzgerald song. The following morning brought an unexpected change when Frank Sr. roused his son early, instructing him to skip school and accompany him to an important business meeting instead. Their first stop was a tailor shop where Frank Sr. hoped to secure a black suit, but the shop owner turned them away, explaining that the store was closed and they didn't loan out clothing. Frank Sr. then cleverly pulled out a gold necklace and asked the woman if she had lost it, using this deceptive tactic to gain her cooperation. Shortly afterward, father and son arrived at Chase Manhattan Bank with Frank Jr. now wearing the borrowed black suit. Frank Sr. instructed his son to remain in the vehicle and posed a question about the Yankees' consistent success. He explained that their distinctive pinstriped uniforms captivated people's attention, using this as a lesson to teach Frank Jr. about the power of distraction and cunning tactics. Frank Sr. then went into the bank seeking a loan, but the bank employee declined his request due to an ongoing tax fraud investigation. Unable to secure the funds he needed, Frank Sr. was forced to exchange their vehicle instead. Subsequently, the family's worsening financial situation and Frank Sr.'s legal troubles with tax authorities compelled them to abandon their home. Nevertheless, Frank Sr. remained committed to supporting his son as best he could under the circumstances. When Frank Jr. turned 16, his father presented him with a checkbook and established a bank account containing $25. With their financial struggles persisting, Frank Jr. had no choice but to attend a public school rather than continue his private education. On his initial day at the new school, Frank Jr. wore his private school uniform simply because it was his usual attire. Upon entering the building, he was immediately confronted by a school bully who pushed him. As Frank Jr. made his way to his assigned classroom, another student commented that his appearance resembled that of a substitute teacher. This observation sparked a spontaneous scheme. Frank Jr. decided to assume the role of a substitute teacher and began directing the students to take their seats, which they obediently did. He continued with this deception, conducting the class while also seizing the chance to embarrass the bully who had shoved him earlier, leaving the aggressive student confused and regretful. Believing he had mistreated an actual faculty member, this masquerade continued for several weeks until the school principal contacted Frank Jr.'s parents. The principal informed them that their son had been impersonating a substitute teacher for an extended period and had even conducted a meeting with parents. While both parents expressed shock at this revelation, Frank Sr. privately felt admiration for his son's clever and audacious behavior. Upon returning home, Frank Jr. was stunned to discover Jack, one of his father's friends, emerging from his mother's bedroom. The sight left him completely bewildered, and his mother, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, attempted to buy his silence by offering him money. Overwhelmed, Frank Jr. retreated to his bedroom and closed the door behind him. As time went on, Frank Jr. arrived home to find yet another unfamiliar man in their house. This time he erupted in anger, but the stranger managed to calm him down and escorted him to where both his parents were waiting. The man revealed himself to be a lawyer and began explaining that Frank Jr.'s parents were proceeding with a divorce. They presented him with legal paperwork and requested that he write down which parent he preferred to live with for custody purposes. Overwhelmed by intense emotions and confusion, the young man found himself unable to make such a difficult choice, so he fled from the room and rushed to the train station in a state of panic. Over the following months, Frank survived by moving between various hotels and temporary accommodations. sustaining himself with the checkbook his father had given him. These checks were entirely fake, as he possessed no actual funds in any bank account. During one instance, Frank, despite being underage, attempted to present himself as a mature businessman while seeking a bank loan. He began developing skills in document and check manipulation to achieve his goals, though he faced rejection at every financial institution he approached due to his inexperience with these techniques. Following another unsuccessful loan attempt, Frank walked past a tailor's storefront displaying an aviator's uniform. At that moment, he witnessed an impressive pilot, accompanied by several attractive flight attendants exiting a taxi. Frank became captivated by this striking scene and the obvious respect and admiration the pilot commanded. This encounter sparked his inspiration to adopt the identity of an airline pilot. Frank devised a clever strategy by posing as a high school journalist researching for a school newspaper article, which allowed him to interview aviation professionals and collect crucial information about pilot operations. He then contacted Pan Am's uniform suppliers through deceptive means, successfully obtaining an authentic pilot uniform and manufacturing fake payroll checks that actual Pan Am employees could deposit. His elaborate deception eventually caught up with him when he was assigned to board an aircraft. As a deadhead without understanding the term's meaning, Frank interacted with genuine pilots and flight crew members, fortunately discovering that deadheading simply referred to a pilot receiving free transportation to reach their next assignment location rather than being required to operate the aircraft. Through his charm and sophisticated deception techniques, Frank eventually managed to accumulate fraudulent checks worth millions of dollars. One afternoon, Frank arranged to meet his father and presented him with a Cadillac as a surprise gift. Although Frank Sr. appreciated the gesture, he declined to use the vehicle, explaining that the IRS would find such an expensive purchase suspicious, given his current legal troubles. He became emotional when Frank Jr. mentioned his mother, but Frank Sr. assured his son that he would continue his efforts to win her back and restore their family unit, which remained Frank Jr.'s greatest desire. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty, a serious and persistent FBI agent, had begun pursuing Frank due to his extensive check fraud activities. Carl successfully located the hotel where Frank was staying and moved quickly toward Frank's room. As Frank approached his hotel room, he encountered Mr. Murphy, a blind elderly gentleman being assisted by his companion in the hallway. Frank politely acknowledged Mr. Murphy before entering his room. Carl entered Frank's room with his weapon drawn and began searching for him. Frank emerged from the bathroom and, despite the threatening situation, maintained his composure while claiming to be Secret Service agent Barry Allen. Although this assertion made Carl somewhat less suspicious, he still requested identification. Before Carl could examine Frank's wallet, Frank cleverly directed his attention to the window, claiming his partner was already capturing the real criminal outside. Carl observed Mr. Murphy being helped into his vehicle by his companion, which seemed to validate Frank's story and caused him to relax his guard. Frank then departed, leaving his wallet behind with Carl. After Frank left, Carl sat on the bed and discovered the wallet contained no identification whatsoever. When he glanced out the window, Frank was already fleeing the scene. After his escape, Frank continued his aviation research by maintaining his disguise as a student journalist working on a paper. Eventually, an airline professional became suspicious and asked him to leave, but not before giving him a newspaper article about a con artist impersonating pilots at various airlines, dubbed the Skyway Man. The article described him as the James Bond of the sky, which gave Frank a new source of inspiration. This comparison motivated Frank to watch the newest James Bond film, after which he purchased the identical suit and automobile featured in the movie. He then checked into a hotel where he encountered an alluring woman and spent the evening with her. During Christmas Eve, Carl Hanratty remained at his office desk working alone. Carl received an unexpected phone call from Frank, who expressed regret for deceiving him earlier and suggested they arrange a meeting at a hotel. Carl dismissed this as a trick and refused to take it seriously. He then emotionally wounded Frank by suggesting that the only reason Frank was calling him was because he had no one else in his life to contact. This harsh observation caused Frank to abruptly end the call. leaving Carl somewhat amused by the interaction. The next morning, Carl had breakfast at a local diner while researching Barry Allen in the telephone directory, discovering multiple listings for people with that name. A young server noticed his paperwork and inquired whether he was interested in Barry Allen, explaining that this was the real name of the comic book character The Flash. This revelation made Carl understand that Frank was merely a teenager. Armed with this crucial insight, he contacted his colleagues to investigate all missing juvenile cases in their search for Frank. Carl and his FBI team eventually located Frank's mother, Paula, who had since remarried and willingly assisted the federal agents. She provided them with her son's yearbook photograph, which enabled Carl to finally identify Frank and learn his actual name. During this same period, Frank was enjoying his newfound wealth by hosting elaborate parties. At one of these gatherings, a friend suffered an injury and required hospitalization, prompting Frank to visit him at the medical facility. There he encountered Brenda Strong, a young nurse, and they immediately formed a mutual attraction. Frank told Brenda he was a physician seeking employment. Initially, his motivation for choosing this particular profession seemed unclear, but he later revealed in correspondence to his father that he was exhausted from his life of deception and hoped to find someone with whom he could build a stable relationship, indicating his growing feelings for Brenda. Frank successfully deceived his way into securing a position as Dr. Frank Connors in a supervisory role at the hospital. At the hospital, Frank and Brenda's mutual attraction developed into a romantic relationship, culminating in a passionate kiss in Frank's office one day. Their intimate moment was cut short when Frank received an urgent call to the emergency room. The medical staff sought his guidance regarding a young boy who had been injured in a bicycle accident. Despite having no medical training whatsoever, Frank managed to bluff his way through the situation and successfully handled the crisis without anyone discovering his deception. During this time, Carl Hanratty paid a visit to Frank Sr., and through their conversation, Carl quickly recognized the source of Frank Jr.'s cunning and manipulative traits. Frank Sr. provided vague and evasive responses whenever Carl questioned him about his son. But as Carl prepared to leave, Frank Sr. declared that he would never abandon or betray his son. At that moment, Carl noticed Frank Jr.'s correspondence scattered across the table and made mental note of the return address information. As time passed, Frank developed genuine romantic feelings for Brenda and eventually proposed marriage to her. She accepted his proposal, and they made arrangements to have lunch with her parents so Frank could meet them properly. During their lunch meeting, Frank mentioned that he was also an attorney, just like Brenda's father. This revelation surprised Brenda, who enthusiastically suggested that her father should hire Frank to work at his law firm. Later, Brenda's father privately questioned Frank about his true identity. Frank responded honestly, stating that he wasn't actually a doctor, lawyer, or airline pilot, that he was essentially nothing more than a young man in love with Brenda. Fortunately for Frank, Brenda's father interpreted this confession as a humble metaphor rather than a literal admission, and he gave Frank his approval to marry his daughter. Frank subsequently took and passed the Louisiana bar examination, then began working at Brenda's father's law practice. He attempted to learn legal procedures on the job but faced difficulties, including being reprimanded by a judge when he made procedural errors. While spending time at the Strong family home, Frank began feeling melancholy as he observed Brenda and her family enjoying their close, harmonious relationships, which reminded him painfully of his own fractured family situation. Frank arranged to meet his father at a bar, where he enthusiastically expressed his belief that they could restore their family unit. Frank Sr., who had taken a job at the Postal Service, delivered the devastating news that Paula had already remarried, which deeply upset Frank Jr. Frank confided in his father that he wanted to end his life of deception and running, but his father urged him to continue his current path. Following this discouraging conversation, Frank Jr. departed. On Christmas Eve, Frank contacted Carl once more, proposing a temporary ceasefire and informing him of his upcoming marriage. Carl responded that he had no alternative but to apprehend Frank, since it was his professional duty. Frank acknowledged that he simply felt obligated to make the request, then wished Carl a Merry Christmas before ending the call. This conversation provided Carl with a valuable clue. He understood that Frank would likely retain his current surname since he was about to wed. It wasn't long before Carl located and infiltrated Frank and Brenda's wedding celebration. Upon spotting Carl's arrival, Frank quickly withdrew to a private room, with Brenda following close behind. Frank finally revealed his complete deception to her and instructed her to meet him at the airport in 2 days' time. The newlyweds shared a devastating farewell immediately after their wedding ceremony. When Carl entered the room moments later, Frank had already escaped. 2 days after their wedding, Frank waited for Brenda at the airport as planned. He became excited when he saw her approaching in a pink shirt with her suitcase. But his joy quickly turned to disappointment when he observed that she appeared to be following directions through a hidden earpiece. Frank carefully examined his surroundings and detected the presence of FBI agents, prompting him to abandon the meeting. Frank then devised a new escape strategy for returning to the airport. He resumed his pilot disguise and created a fictitious internship program, which he presented to 8 young women from a local school. Despite Carl positioning approximately 100 agents throughout airport security to watch for Frank, Frank managed to walk directly through the entrance wearing his pilot uniform, accompanied by his group of attractive fake flight attendants who successfully diverted the attention of the male security personnel. Frank successfully evaded capture once again and departed the country by air. 7 months passed, and the FBI had grown tired of pursuing Frank, with Carl being the only agent who remained determined to capture him. Carl eventually discovered that all the checks they had recovered from Frank were genuine checks. This realization prompted him to consult with specialists about what type of equipment could manufacture such authentic-looking checks. The experts informed him that similar machines were available in other countries as well. Carl recalled his previous conversation with Paula and deduced that Frank might have fled to his mother's hometown in France. Carl successfully located Frank in Montrechard on Christmas Eve, as local residents were gathering at a nearby church. He entered the check printing facility and discovered Frank mass-producing hundreds of checks. Frank, appearing frightened and worn down, greeted Carl as if he were a longtime friend. At this moment, Carl seemed almost protective and worried about Frank's well-being, so he attempted to persuade Frank to surrender voluntarily. Carl warned him that the French authorities were furious and humiliated by the situation, and they were now planning to eliminate Frank rather than arrest him. Frank ultimately agreed to surrender to Carl, but once they stepped outside, French authorities arrested him and transported him to a local detention facility. The harsh prison conditions nearly killed Frank during his incarceration there. Carl eventually arranged for Frank's transfer back to the United States. During their flight home, Carl delivered the devastating news that Frank's father had passed away. Overwhelmed by grief, Frank managed to escape from the aircraft through the airplane's restroom. He rushed to his mother's residence, where she now lived with her new spouse. Despite his desperate attempts to reconnect, Frank discovered that his remaining hope had been completely extinguished. He witnessed that his mother had established a new life for herself and now had a young daughter with her current husband. Having lost his father and any possibility of reuniting his original family, Frank found himself without the motivation to continue his previous lifestyle. He ultimately surrendered to Carl, who had arrived with additional FBI agents. Frank received a sentence of 12 years in a high-security correctional facility, and Carl made regular visits to see him during his imprisonment. On one particular visit, Carl presented Frank with a counterfeit check from an active case he was investigating. Frank immediately recognized that a bank employee was complicit in the fraudulent operation. Carl was so impressed by Frank's analytical abilities that he persuaded the FBI to allow Frank to complete his remaining sentence while working for the Bureau's Bank Fraud Division. Frank accepted this arrangement and began collaborating with Carl, despite the reservations expressed by other FBI personnel. During a routine walk through the city, Frank discovered a tailor's storefront displaying an aviator uniform, which brought back memories of his previous deceptive activities. As the weekend approached, Frank felt overwhelmed by loneliness, having no friends or family members to provide emotional support. This isolation triggered a regression to his former behavior patterns, and during the weekend, he put on a pilot's uniform with the intention of boarding an aircraft. However, Carl intercepted him before he could proceed and explained that Frank was no longer being pursued by anyone. Carl told him that if Frank chose to leave, he wouldn't prevent him, but he was confident that Frank would eventually return on his own. When Monday arrived, Carl anxiously awaited Frank's decision about his future. To Carl's great relief, Frank returned and resumed assisting him with their current investigation. Frank had finally discovered a place where he truly belonged and felt valued. This extraordinary tale is a true story. The teenage con artist who once forged his way across continents found redemption in the most unexpected ways. 26 years of marriage, 3 children, and a quiet life in the Midwest. The boy who ran from the law became the very authority protecting others from his former crimes, now the world's leading expert on financial fraud. Most remarkably, his friendship with Carl Hanratty endures. The FBI agent who once hunted him relentlessly became his lifelong ally.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe for more recaps. See you next time.